Now, if you've read the Thousand Year Blood War arc of Bleach, you'll know that the former captain of the 7th Division, Sajin Komamura, staked everything he had on the battle against the Quincy's in an attempt to avenge the fallen Yamamoto. In order to achieve this, Komamura acquired an awesome, mysterious new power, the ultimate technique of the Beast Clan Jinka no Jutsu, or humanification. This technique quite literally transformed his once beast-like body into that of a human's, granting him the unbelievable power of total immortality. But of course, this comes at a drastic cost. At the culmination of his quest for vengeance, Komamura tore out his own heart as quite a literal statement of what he had become. And his ultimate goal was to get to Yhwach, the murderer of Yamamoto, and bring him to justice. Now, of course, unfortunately for Sajin, we know he doesn't quite make it that far. After defeating the Sturmritter Bambietta and saving the lives of Shinji and Hinamori, Komamura's humanification technique quickly fades away, wearing off, and we watch as he collapses to the ground, desperate to reach Yhwach, only to turn into a fully fledged beast, a symbol of his regression, a symbol of his quest for vengeance. But what if Komamura's Jinka no Jutsu technique had actually lasted longer than just that one fight? What if everything he had worked towards actually paid off and he managed to reach Silburn and even step foot into the throne room of Yhwach? Considering his immortality, would Komamura have actually stood a chance against the almighty king of the Quincy's? Well, it's been a very long time, about 6 months since we've done a what if video on this channel, so today, that's what we're going to take a look at. Before we begin, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, guys, make sure to do that now, as you're in the perfect place for Bleach content just like this every single week. And if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to leave it a thumbs up as well, because it really does help support the channel, but it also gives the video more reach on YouTube and helps it get to other Bleach fans just like yourselves. And of course, if you do want to support me a little step further, the channel has a Patreon now where you can go and support me there for as little as $1 a month, and you can gain early access to videos. And of course, a massive thank you goes out to everyone who's a patron there so far. Honestly, your support is so appreciated. Thank you very much. So these what if videos are quite fun, but I really haven't done an awful lot of them yet. The last one was about 6 months ago now. And I really have been wanting to do this idea of human Sajin versus Yhwach for a while now, as I think it's quite an interesting circumstance and something that we could have potentially got in the manga, as that is where Komamura's storyline was ultimately pushing him towards. Now, we know, of course, in the manga that Komamura's driving force, the reason he goes to such lengths to acquire this amazing new power, is to avenge Yamamoto, the man who once took him in despite looking like a beast. And then, of course, Yamamoto is murdered in cold blood by the king of the Quincy's, Yhwach, and now Komamura has his sights on this man and wants to bring him down. Instead, however, he decides to go and take on Bambietta Bastabine beforehand, despite already having his Bankai returned to him, so I'm not entirely sure why he does that, unless, of course, he didn't realise there was some kind of restriction or time limit on his Jinka no Jutsu ability. Ostensibly, it could have just been to save the lives of the Shinigami she was attacking. Perhaps he felt some kind of responsibility to do so, as he has faced her in the past. Regardless, he defeats her using his amazing new powers, but collapses almost instantly afterwards, very reminiscent of something like Ichigo's Mugetsu, his final Getsuga Tensho transformation that crumbled away immediately after usage. And Komamura sadly collapses to his knees, swearing that he will bring down Yhwach and avenge Yamamoto, but he doesn't manage it. So in my mind, I've thought I've got two different scenarios for this what if video, where both times Komamura reaches Yhwach. And I've got to be honest, like, you guys know that I love Komamura. He's like one of my favourite captains against all odds. I don't think he comes out of either of these scenarios particularly well, even with the humanification technique. And as always with these what if videos, I will always try and stick to the established canon as much as possible, so it will always follow on from an established point in the story. And so, it makes sense to begin with the end of the Bambietta fight. So he has just smacked her bomb right back at her using Dangai Joe, his essentially uncloaked Bankai. She has fallen somewhere miles away like she does, and Komamura lands on the ground before turning to Silburn, Yhwach's throne room in his sights, and deciding to go after him. Now this time, he doesn't collapse to the floor. Instead, he leaps to Silburn, goes absolutely flying, because I imagine he is just so pent up at this point, so full of this animalistic revenge that he's not even really thinking properly. And he just kind of leaps through the buildings and arrives at Silburn pretty much unimpeded. I had this really cool visual in my head that Yhwach is just sort of sitting there in his throne. We know from relatively recent chapters that he is just kind of sat there overlooking the battlefield. Uryu may even be by his side still. And I could just see it in the manga. This idea of Yhwach surveying the landscape, maybe even noticing that Bambietta has fallen, and suddenly Komamura's foot comes crashing down at the entrance to his throne room, way behind him, and he just screams, Yhwach, like just at the top of his voice. And Yhwach is, of course, virtually unmoved. I think you would have an awesome, really cool display of power for Komamura. He just takes out a bunch of soldat that try and attack him. And maybe Uryu would make some kind of comment about the fact that Komamura doesn't look like a beast anymore, if he's still there. Now, if Uryu is still there, I think Komamura would make some kind of comment about the fact that he is there, because Komamura is all about loyalty, and he would be disgusted that it appears that Uryu has betrayed his friends to side with Yhwach. Now, Yhwach himself is an interesting one. We've rarely seen him moved or fazed by anything, and I don't think that Komamura just arriving in the throne room and defeating some soldat would change that. As far as we know, Yhwach maybe doesn't even know who Komamura is, outside of just the cursory fact that he's a captain, so him being a human might not faze him. However, Yhwach is old enough and world-weary enough that maybe he knows of the Beast Clan, and maybe he even knows of Jinka no Jutsu. I think you could get a really awesome exchange between these two characters, where Komamura is just very blunt, very to the point where he's like, you know, you killed Genryusai, I'm here to take your life. Very reminiscent of basically what Yamamoto said to Yhwach in the first invasion. And actually, I would think that could be a really cool mirror image, a parallel that will eventually parallel Komamura's fate. Yamamoto obviously arrived in that battle completely incensed, just enraged. He wasn't thinking straight, and he arrives crashing down, and he says, you know, Yhwach, I've come to take your life. I can imagine Kubo pulling a parallel between them, Komamura saying something very similar. Now, if Yhwach does know about the Jinka no Jutsu, or even the Beast Clan, I can imagine him sort of, you know, saying like, oh, this, you know, and this is an incredibly ancient technique. It's impressive that you've managed to wield it. And your devotion to Yamamoto is inspiring. You know, he perhaps says quite mockingly, not even getting up from his chair. I like the idea that Yhwach kind of goads Komamura, kind of recognises that Komamura is in this completely maddened state. And I can kind of almost get a Baragon vibe from Yhwach, where he's like, to be honest though, I don't think you can even move me from this chair, despite having sacrificed everything to reach this point. And I think Yhwach would probably try and push him like that. If Yhwach doesn't know about the immortality, I think things go slightly differently. I think, you know, you get Komamura kind of just absolutely enraged, sends his spiritual pressure everywhere, destroys like a bunch of the ground and stuff. Very reminiscent to the Soul Society arc when he just destroys a part of the ground just after drawing his blade. And he basically just rushes at Yhwach. And I can see Yhwach being very cocky about it, barely even moving, because also bear in mind Yhwach does not have the Almighty at this point, so you get potential for a more brutal smackdown, which is what I was really hoping for if these two characters met. Both of these two characters are huge, hulking behemoths of people. They both command an immense screen presence, and I think it would be really cool to see them tangle. So I can kind of imagine Komamura just appearing in front of Yhwach, bringing his blade down for one massive hit, and Yhwach just kind of catching it in his hand. not being particularly impressed at all. Now, one visual I keep getting in my head that I would love to see, again, imagine that they are in the throne room, so there is a ceiling above them. But I can just imagine Komamura like pushing down on Yhwach and his eyes just flaring up and he just goes, Tenken! Activates Tenken. This massive arm just comes through the ceiling and down on Yhwach's throne. Yhwach, couple of things could happen here. Either he can still block Tenken or the throne is destroyed, at which point Komamura is like, I moved you from your throne after all. So there are a couple of questions we need to answer before we move ahead, and that's about the true nature of the humanification technique. So here's what we do know. We know that Komamura can't be killed. He can't die. There's quite an important distinction to make here. He cannot die, but can he still feel pain? It's difficult to say because Bambietta only seems to really land a couple of hits on him, and Komamura is very tanky anyway. But there's one time where she sends a couple of bombs into the chest of Bankai Joe, and you see Komamura sort of take the hit, and he seems to be absolutely fine. Another question I have is, to what extent does the damage done to Bankai Joe really reflect on Sajin? Because at one point, Bambietta literally blows up Bankai Joe's hand. You see it reform. But I'm going to guess that Komamura's hand didn't just explode. Maybe it did, but you don't see it come back. You don't see it reform. So it makes things difficult for us. A, does he feel pain? And B, can he still be, dismembered? Because my personal opinion is, with this confrontation, there's no way Komamura wins. Even with immortality, I don't think he wins. Yhwach is effectively the closest thing to God the series has ever seen. Even with the Almighty, he was still going toe-to-toe with Ichibei until Ichibei got the upper hand. And Komamura, as much as I love the guy, is probably nowhere near as powerful as Ichibei. Another question I have as well, and it's again a difficult one to answer because Komamura only goes up against Bambietta. And when I say only, I don't mean it in a disparaging way, but that is the only person we see him fight. So does the humanification technique actually make Komamura any stronger, or is he exactly the same except he can't die? Either way, I don't think he wins. That's just the brutal truth of it. So yeah, basically, carrying on, Komamura brings down his sword, and then Yhwach's like, really? Is that the best you can do? Before he finishes his sentence, Komamura screams Tenken. The massive, now of course, ungloved hand comes crashing through the ceiling and decimates the throne. And Komamura, chides Yhwach, saying like, I've sacrificed everything. I've put my life on the line to ensure that your life is extinguished. And I won't fall until that's done, until that's accomplished. And Yhwach probably gets up to his feet again, a cruel grin on his face as shadows fall across his face, and maybe he tells Uryu to leave. Or potentially even cooler, he says to Uryu something like, stay and watch and see what happens to one of these captains who gets a little bit too big for their boots. But obviously Komamura keeps attacking Yhwach. I don't think Komamura's fighting style really changes. I don't think we see really any Kido. I think he just attacks him like crazy. And I think the first major upset comes when Yhwach does some serious damage to Komamura, or at least thinks he has killed him. So, yeah, again, I can imagine Yhwach just catching the blade and being like, it doesn't matter what you've done, you can't stand up to me, and he just blasts a hole in Komamura. And I think you would get, again, a really awesome moment, potentially, where Yhwach thinks he's dead, Komamura just sort of drops to his knees, but he's obviously still alive, and there's just a gaping hole in his chest. Whether or not he, reforms, we don't really know. But then Komamura just stabs Yhwach with his blade, and that's the first, and maybe Komamura even draws blood, and that's enough to shock Yhwach and be like, how are you still alive? Of course, if he knows the ins and outs of Jinka no Jutsu, this is not going to be applicable. But basically, Komamura, I can imagine this really, just imagine it in your head, it's this great scene. You're looking at Yhwach's side on with Sajin's side on. Sajin's on his knees, but his blade is in Yhwach's chest. And Sajin's like covered in sweat. There's blood coming out of his mouth. He's like, I came all this way. You know, I gave up my heart so I could kill you. And you can just see behind them, you know, the expanse of the battlefield. They're silhouetted against it. Very similar to the Kyoraku and Rukia panel I put up from the latest chapter. And I think it ends tragically for Komamura either way, because I think obviously that's what Kubo's going for. I would have just loved to have seen more from this. And I also just always thought it really weird that Komamura went through all of that just to never even get anywhere near his target. That was so weird to me. So I'd have loved to have seen this. This could have literally been a chapter or two. I think the best Komamura does is land a surprise hit at best when Yhwach thinks he is dead. But Komamura's like down on his knees, his sword is like rattling in his hand. Maybe he activates Bankai, but I think it would be like over pretty quickly. I think either Yhwach just completely dismembers Komamura to the point where immortality doesn't matter. I think that's a bit dark and a bit disrespectful to the character. It's not what I think Kubo would do. I think Kubo would have it so that Komamura is pushing Yhwach, even though Yhwach is, you know, he's not really trying at this point. Kind of similar perhaps to the Ichibei fight, except Yhwach's not really in as much danger. But Komamura is, you know, smashing away with his sword. Maybe he activates Bankai and Dangai Joe rises up, smashes up through the throne room and attacks him again. Yhwach just blows a hole through Dangai Joe's head or something, and Komamura is just down on the floor again. And I think Komamura probably does run out of time again. And personally, I would still be more satisfied with that than what we actually got. And I've said this before on the channel that I actually love Komamura's storyline. I really do. I just think it ended too early. It ended so weirdly to kind of put all that emphasis on Komamura, because he really is the only one of the 4 Bankai-less captains to actually get some kind of really cool development out of it. And it's kind of all, again, I don't mean to say wasted in a disparaging way, but wasted on a fight with a, you know, mid-tier Sternritter. At the same time, I kind of like and appreciate that Komamura doesn't get to achieve, or even get close to achieving his goal because he's gone down the wrong path. I kind of like that notion that he is like collapsing to the ground and he can't quite get there. It's just out of reach. But I think you can achieve the same thing with this what if scenario. I think you do get the same thing, and Komamura gets to look like a badass, and Yhwach also gets to look dangerous as well. You get those two advantages here with that. And I just think Komamura collapses to the ground, turning into a dog, like he does with the Bambietta fight. And now there's a couple of outcomes here. And the outcome we get depends really on your perception of Yhwach as a character. So either Komamura just collapses as a dog and Yhwach just straight up kills him by, you know, shooting him like he does with his, like, reishi gun finger that he just had at the start of the arc. Or something that I also think would work really well is like Yhwach just sees him as so pitiful. And, you know, again, with the parallels to Yamamoto, just puts his foot on this dog and just rolls him off the side. You know, I would love to see something like that. Like, Komamura just falls from the throne room. Maybe Iba watches from afar. He's like, oh my, like, Captain, ... And I think that would be so cool. I think that would be awesome. Like, Yhwach's like, you know, you dared to step foot in this throne room. In the end, you've turned out exactly the same as he did. You know, talking about Genryu's-san just kicks Sajin off the side. I think no matter what, unfortunately, Sajin's story ends in tragedy. And as much as I like the guy, I think it's fitting for him. Like I said, I'd just like to have seen a bit more out of it. And so I think that would be honestly really awesome, just to get this even a small fight. I love the visuals, the idea of him bringing Tenken through the ceiling to attack Yhwach, him arriving in the throne room and just screaming at him. I could totally see him doing that as well. And it would have just been awesome to see a bit more of human Komamura. Now, the second scenario I had is more outlandish, and I wouldn't necessarily like this one as much. And it essentially ends up with exactly the same outcome. But basically, Komamura defeats Bambietta and turns his attention to Silburn, but this time Iba actually arrives like he does in the manga and convinces Sajin to regroup with the Gotei and aid in the war effort and, you know, say, like, you'll get your chance at Yhwach soon, Captain, but right now we have to deal with the fight that's ongoing. And I just think that would be awesome, because this is so weird to me still that Komamura, like, never sees anyone again after that. And, you know, obviously there's Can't Fear Your Own World, but I'm talking about in the actual fight. Komamura basically never really sees anyone again. So I'd love him to regroup with everyone. Everyone gets a, you know, shocked moment when they see him as a human. And he even travels up to the royal palace with everyone else. And then he just hotfoots it to Yhwach, who is obviously almighty Yhwach at this point. Again, sitting there in his throne, being like, you know, you can't even make me move. Quite literally this time, as he just sends a wave of a torrent of Reiatsu at Sajin. And I think Sajin, again, loses even faster this time. I can imagine you get something maybe akin to Ichigo versus Aizen on Sokyoku Hill this time, where Sajin just lands in front of Yhwach, and he kind of says, basically, like, just yells at him, like, Yhwach, you know, you will pay for your crimes. Brings out his sword, Bankai, Dangai Joe, and this massive thing rises up, and then he's instantly taken out. That's basically what I think would happen if he went up against almighty Yhwach. Yhwach would pretty much not even move. Komamura would just sort of be, like, collapsing to his knees, like, you know, Genri Saidono, I failed you. As he just topples over, probably dead, I think, in this instance. I don't think almighty Yhwach is likely to let him live. That's why I think this scenario, I'm not going to spend as much time on it. I think it's more outlandish. Plus, this scenario involves the humanification technique lasting for, like, 2 days, which I don't think it was going to do. Regardless, the crux of this particular episode of Bleach What If just revolves around the fact that I'd have loved to have seen more of human Sajin. And I think both of these characters win in this scenario. Yhwach gets another moment to be a total badass, instead of just sitting in a throne stationary for the entire second invasion, pretty much. And Komamura gets to go out in a blaze of glory in essentially the same manner he goes out anyway, but he gets that bit closer, and it makes his story worth that bit more, I think. If he actually gets to the point where he challenges Yhwach, the killer of Genryusai. I'd love to see that. I think that would have been awesome. And it's honestly something I'm, like, really tempted to draw. Like, I could never make it look as good as Kubo's, obviously, but I think it'd be really fun. I think it'd be really fun to visualize some of these what-if scenarios in general. I'd love to do that. But that's pretty much it for this episode of Bleach What If, I guess. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below if you would have liked to have seen human Sajin reach Yhwach. Do you think he would have done better than I depicted him doing? I think Sajin gets a couple of cool moments, but ultimately is overwhelmed and probably loses in much the same way as he loses himself after the Bambietta fight anyway. And the second question again is, if Komamura did transform into a dog in front of Yhwach, does Yhwach kill him, or, you know, just get rid of him like I suggested? I would prefer that, but I don't know if it's realistic. So that's it for this episode, guys. Like I said, let me know in the comments below what you think. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to hit subscribe as well. Keep pushing us towards 100,000. We are getting there, really quite close now. So yeah, I'd really appreciate your support. But until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.